Yes, you may be able to speak like a proficient user, but can you write like one? In today's video, with English class, we're going to be looking at how to write an essay in Proficiency, Part 1. Okay guys, first of all, the essay is based on two texts, two short texts, of which you should summarize two key points which are to be found in each text. So text 1 would have two key points and text 2 would have two key points. The two texts have opinions on the same topic, which you must talk about in your answer. Now, the two texts may present opinions which are contrasting or consistent with each other. So they may have some points or opinions that are very similar. Now, in general, your essay doesn't have to follow any particular structure, but today we're going to look at one particular structure that could be very useful for you. Of course, before we start to write our essay, we must have a plan. Here we're going to use a 3-step plan before we start to write our essay. It's a very simple, straightforward plan. Step 1. Here is where you analyze the texts, okay? Decide if they are complementary or they are contrasting, and underline the two key points found in each text. Step 2. Paraphrase and summarize. Here is where you should look to brainstorm different ideas to paraphrase. How are you going to take something from the text and put it into your own words? And of course, summarize the points. Here is where we could also look to use some impressive structures such as expressions, inversions, collocations, and even passive structures. Step 3. Evaluate and react. This is where you decide which points you agree with and which points you don't agree with. So here you could brainstorm your own thoughts and experiences on the matter. So pretty straightforward, guys, no? Summarize, evaluate, react. Let's look at a pretty straightforward structure to tackle the essay. Paragraph number 1, this is where we identify the main points of each text, but in our own words. We're paraphrasing, right? So remember these impressive structures that we should look to use. Here we could start with an inversion. You could say something like, hardly a week goes by without another report of, and then you would note down the topic you're talking about, in the media. And then you could say something like, again using a very impressive structure, which would be in this case a rhetorical question. How are we to gauge the effects of such changes, shifts, or developments? Choose whichever word you would say fits well with what you're writing about. Now here is where you're going to identify the main points in both texts. You could start here by saying something like, remember in the same paragraph, paragraph 1, the first mentions, etc., etc., whereas the second considers, etc., etc., etc. Paragraph number 2, here we're looking at the summary of the key points. Instead of repeating the word text, we could say something like, the first passage argues that. And then you summarize the key points found in passage 1. Then the second passage argues that, and you do the exact same. Paragraph 3. This is where we evaluate the key points and ideas. Here we could start by saying something like, as I see it, the first text makes or does not make a convincing argument. And you develop on the idea, and then you could write something like, we should, etc., etc., or we should not. So this is where you add your own idea. And then the same goes for the second text. Now in the same paragraph you could write something like, the second text makes a better or worse case. And here you could write something like, we could or we could not, and then you give your own idea in relation to the second text. And then paragraph 4. This is where we should agree or disagree with the key points. You could start by saying something like, all things considered, I believe that. Okay guys, perfect. Now we're going to look at an example task. The task question would be something like, read the two texts below. Write an essay summarizing and evaluating the key points from both texts. Use your own words throughout as far as possible and include your own ideas in your answers. So here's our two texts. As we can see, it's talking about nature. 1, should it be left alone? And 2, does it inspire us? So following the structure we've previously mentioned in the video, now we're going to tackle the essay question. So we can start here by saying something like, hardly a week goes by without another report of how to further protect nature. And here, after our inversion, we write our rhetorical question. Very good. How are we to gauge the effects of such developments? Now remember, are the texts complementary or are they contrasting? Well, let's have a look. Here we could write something like, both extracts discuss the idea that it is important to protect the natural world, but in different ways. The first mentions the necessity of campaigning to protect nature, whereas the second considers the benefits of nature. Paragraph number 2, the summary of the key points. We could start by saying something like, the first passage, I've used passage because we've already used text before. The first passage argues that we are to avoid any disruption to the balance of nature. And then you would go on to summarize the key point a little bit more in your own words. Remember, it's very important to paraphrase. Then the second passage argues that we should protect nature because it inspires us. And then the same again. You develop a little bit on this summary of the key points in text 2. Then we move on to paragraph 3. Evaluate the key points and ideas. Here you could start by saying something like, as I see it, first text does not make a convincing argument. We should guard against the degradation of nature in order to avoid wiping out plants and animals. Now, the second text makes a better case. Evaluate the point a bit more and then say something like, we can learn, or we could learn from nature if we protect it, as stated in text 2, when it acknowledges that the man interacts with nature. Now on to the conclusion, guys. Here we have to agree or disagree with the key points. All things considered, I believe that it is the benefits we get from nature that is the stronger reason to minimize the impact we have on the natural world. Maybe you could add something again in the last lines, such as we should limit our consumption of animals and plants because, or etc, etc. So guys, that is all for today from English class. If you would like to have a go at an essay task yourself, I'll leave a picture here for you to read and possibly write up your own essay. And finally, here are some tips if you really want to try and tackle this essay and do the best you can. So, what you must keep in mind is that you read the text carefully, underline 4 key points, decide how far you agree with these points or even disagree, list some relevant ideas of your own, try to plan within 4 to 5 paragraphs rather than a whole rough copy answer. Select 1 or 2 important phrases, use your own words, and try to keep a consistent impersonal tone throughout. So I hope you liked the video today, guys, with English class. Leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.